Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Coronado Roundtable. I'm Christian Escoven, the president, and I'm happy to see you all here this morning. We have a great speaker and a great subject. We have, as you know, our former mayor and longtime council member, Casey Tanaka. He's waiting here in the wings, but we'll get to our speaker in just a few moments. But first, if I can ask you to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As I think you know, our programs are recorded live on Zoom, and for that, I'd like to thank the Coronado Public Library and its staff for continuing to provide this service for us and the community. And I'd like to thank again Selena Ayadolid in the back, handling the audiovisual presentation. For those viewing at home, please mute your computer or your device, and please turn off your camera. You may use the chat box for the Q&A portion of the program that will follow. The recording will be available to view on the library's YouTube channel a few days after this program. For those of you in the room, please silence your mobile phones. And please hold your questions until we hand you a mic for that portion of the program. And that's so that your questions can be presented with the rest of the audiovisual portion recorded by the mic. Our coffee this morning is provided by Alex of the Amalo Brew, the coffee cart in front of the library. We do ask for a $3 donation, and that provides all of our funding for our operations, which are minimal in terms of funding, but we do also provide an annual gift to the library. And our program for next month will have the city's representative to the Port Commission. So that'll be next month, August 28th, at 10 o'clock here in the Win Room. And now to introduce our speaker, our own Coronado Roundtable board member, Suzanne Pop. Please, Suzanne.
Thank you, Christian. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Casey Tanaka. Mr. Casey Tanaka has been teaching AP U.S. History at Coronado High School for the past 27 years, and today he will speak about American history in celebration of the nation's 250th birthday. Casey will speak about the countervailing roles played by unity and disunity leading up to the writing and adoption of the Constitution of the United States. In addition to his years teaching at Coronado High School, Casey has previously served as the Coronado City Council for 18 years, 8 of those as Coronado's 50th mayor from 2008 to 2016. In his spare time, Mr. Tanaka enjoys golf, growing plumerias, and spending time with his dog, Leo McCary, named after a character from the TV series West Wing. Mr. Tanaka also has a new position and title at CHS as co-athletic director of CHS. Congratulations, Casey. I also understand that he's a member of Golfers Against Good Golf. His call sign is Brassy. I don't know why. On a personal note, Casey is one of the most respected teachers at our school system. My children, who were mostly science majors, they love history because of Casey. They also have voted in every election, so I attribute that to Casey. Thank you, Casey, and welcome.
The Coronado Rotary Club was celebrating the 250th birthday of the United States. If you understand that birthday, that's the birthday of our Declaration of Independence. It's not the birthday of the Constitution, but they had several speakers and they asked me to speak about the Constitution. So that means I have to kind of tell you where the Constitution fits into the story. And the Constitution, we're only up to 237 years on the Constitution. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Constitution fits into our story of the United States. And something that I think is interesting about the United States is that sometimes disunity ends up being a good thing. And, at the end, I'm going to talk about, just briefly, well, we've got a lot of disunity now. Is that going to be a good thing for us, or is it going to play out differently? Now, the other thing I wanted to make unique to all of you as Roundtable participants, and you can't see it. I was once the president of Coronado High School Roundtable. So my last Roundtable presentation was 32 years ago. So I thought I would put that up there. You can see down here, Roundtable officers. And they didn't list me as president. My advisor said, well, at least they listed you as in front. So you can't talk about US history without going first to the fact that we started out as parts of England. So you can't speak US history without speaking some British history. And the first 3 permanent British settlements were Jamestown in 1607 in Virginia, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay in Massachusetts. So those are, in US history, famous markers because it's the beginning of the United States. If you didn't know it, you've probably heard of Plymouth Rock, but the people who went to Plymouth 13 years later were actually meaning to go to Jamestown. They just got blown off track and landed in Massachusetts. And then Massachusetts Bay by 1630 had its own identity as being mostly religious, whereas the people going to Virginia were mostly young men trying to get rich. But when you teach colonial history, being colonies of England, one of the terms that usually comes up is the term salutary neglect or benign neglect. So first, if I asked you a government question, what does it mean if you are charged with neglect? That means you didn't feed your kid, didn't house your kid, didn't clothe your kid. So that's not an option. You must take care of your kids in the United States. So this term salutary neglect means our parent, England, did not take care of her colonies, her kids. And we all know there were 13 colonies, but salutary means beneficial. So once in a while, it's a good thing not to take care of your kids. And my evidence would be the Home Alone movies. In Home Alone, the kid gets left home alone, but he manages to defend himself against robbers. It turns out great, and so on. And so there really is an academic term for this time period of roughly 1607 to 1763, where the British start colonies, and the colonies get used to governing themselves. And the number one thing you could be doing if you're governing yourselves, passing your own laws, managing your own budget. And so some of the laws, these colonies like Virginia and Massachusetts and Georgia, they were passing tax laws and then handling the spending, taxing and spending. And so this time period is famous because the British delegated that away. They let the colonies, to a large extent, govern themselves. And that's why Americans love democracy so much. We have a history with it. We started out making our own rules, handling our own affairs. And something that's interesting when you look at foreign problems with other countries, like why isn't Iran more democratic? They don't have a history with it the way we do. And there are a lot of countries, frankly, that don't have a history of democracy in the way that we do, that we started out that way, kind of governing ourselves. Now, I don't need to tell you a whole lot about this time period because for the most part, things worked out between England and her colonies. But there is a large war from 1756 to 1763 that was known broadly as the 7 Years' War. But in North America, it was specifically known as the French and Indian War. Before I go on, I want to be clear about something. The 7 Years' War was a world war between the British and the French. And when I say it's a world war, the British and French were fighting each other all over the place in Europe, North America, and so on. This 7 Years' War is such a big, broad war that, again, there's a specific segment of it being fought in North America between the 13 British colonies against the French and their Indian allies, hence that term, the French and Indian War. When the war is over, there are a couple of key consequences. So consequence one, who won? England won. So the side that America is on wins this war. And ordinarily you would say, well, phew, that's a good thing. Second consequence, England's broke. So good news for England, they won. Bad news, they exhausted their finances in defeating the French. That's how big this war is. So historians would tell you the end of salutary neglect comes about with the end of this war, specifically in 1763. Now, the term no taxation without representation, obviously that's something that you should recognize. And it comes about because after this war is over, the British abandoned salutary neglect because they need to come up with new ways to raise money. And the two best ways to fix your finances are either to find new sources of revenue, tax people more, or to cut your expenses, spend less on these colonies. And so the British tried to do a combination of both. Well, I'll have to tell you about it. They passed, the Stamp Act, the tea tax. The British passed a number of laws that upset the colonists. And what the colonists were actually angry about wasn't that they're being asked to pay more. They were upset that they weren't represented in Parliament. So again, this is an important distinction because in the end, this war could have been avoided. We could still be having tea and crumpets and saying God save the king if the British had been a little smarter. The British did not believe we needed representation in Parliament. And in fact, I would imagine their answer is, you're already represented there by all of us. You're fine. And so again, the colonists, that was what they resented. They didn't resent that they were being asked to chip in more. They resented that they weren't being treated like British citizens. Why do you get to live in Dublin, Castershire and get to elect a minister of parliament? But if you're in the colonies, you get zero. So I'll ask you a question and then I'll answer it for you. How many people were living out in these 13 colonies by, say, 1775? Answer, 2.5 million. Not a small number, right? If there are 2.5 million of you, yeah, you probably should have a few members of parliament. I mentioned a moment ago, we could still be part of England if the British had just been savvy enough to say, fine, I'll give you 3 members of parliament. If they had come up with some number, placated, I think it probably would have worked out. But the British wouldn't do it. The British instead were like, I'll give you a warm glass of shut up. You're not getting anything. And of course, the colonists start rebelling, start throwing tea overboard, and so on. Now, the Boston Massacre happens in 1770. The Boston Tea Party happens in 1773. And I'm going to jump you ahead. The war between the colonies and England begins by 1775. I mentioned one of the themes of this talk is unity versus disunity. So one of the things that's creating unity in all 13 of the colonies is they all want to be treated fairly, whether it's a member of parliament, to be treated like good British citizens. So first, if I ask you, where are Lexington and Concord located? They're in Massachusetts. Another thing to know about the Revolutionary War is it starts by accident. The British didn't say, let's go fight these guys. The colonists didn't say, let's go fight these guys. It happens by accident. The British had heard that weapons or munitions were being stored in Lexington. They march on Lexington. They don't find what they're looking for. Maybe someone gets a little mouthy. They fire. And again, the Redcoats don't feel too bad about it because I'm in charge. They march on to the next city, Concord, and the people in Lexington who had been shut up. That's where you get Paul Revere riding ahead to warn the people in Concord, to arms, the British are coming. The people in Concord don't wait to get shot. The people in Concord are like, well, the Redcoats are going to come shoot me. I have an idea. I'm going to shoot them first. The other thing that's interesting about this time period is there's a certain rule for how you should be fighting. My side should all be marching, aiming, firing. It's just a steady march towards one another. That's not how the people in Concord handled it. The people in Concord are like, I don't even think they thought about what the rules were. They just thought about what's the best way to kill a redcoat. Hide behind a tree, duck. And so the Redcoats find themselves getting kind of slowly but steadily sniped and shot at. And that's not how they were trained to fight. And so, in a simplistic sense, the Redcoats won at Lexington, they lost at Concord. The colonials chased the Redcoats back to Boston out of Concord. A cliche I like to use at this point is you can't put the toothpaste back into the tube. If you have a big tube and you squirt it all out, you screwed up. You buy some new toothpaste. When you kill people, it's really hard to get people to say, Well, don't do it again, Len. You killed me once. Don't kill two people, okay? You go have fun. So once you kill some redcoats, once you kill some Massachusetts people, cooler heads aren't going to prevail. You're going to want revenge. You're going to want, like, we have to do something about it. And so I'm pausing again because I'm going to skip you to the 250th anniversary. July of 1776. How big of a gap goes on between people getting killed and everyone agreeing, unifying, having unity, saying it's time to do this? About a year. So I'll ask you another question. Who's at war right now as of April 20th, 1775? It's just Massachusetts against England. The other 12 colonies haven't been fired upon. It's not their fight. And so they have the meeting of the Second Continental Congress where they all gather in Philadelphia and they're talking about it. They're like, what should we do? What should we do in Pennsylvania or New York or Georgia or Rhode Island? Massachusetts was clear. We need to unify, form an army. We need to fight back. The other 12 were like, Massachusetts, pump the brakes. And they literally sent an olive branch petition. They sent a letter to the king saying, let's work this out. That's not what Massachusetts voted against the olive branch. New England voted against the olive branch. But that's why it took, again, a year before we have something to celebrate this year and the 250th anniversary. It took a year to convince all 13 to unify. And it's obvious why, because I'm not at war. The British aren't attacking me in North Carolina. So the other 12 have to think about this. Is this really my fight, or is this just your fight, Massachusetts? I have to think about this. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned they wrote a letter to the king saying, let's work this out. The king wrote back, and the king said, you're being traitors. I murder traitors. Stop being a traitor. That's the essence of his logic. It wasn't, let's work it out. You don't have a right to be a traitor. You're being a traitor. Stop being a traitor, or I'm going to start killing you. That's what helped unite the 13. At that point, the ones who were holding out, who weren't sure what to do, they were sure at that point. They finally came around and said, we need to join Massachusetts in this fight, and so on. So that's what we're celebrating as a birthday. Now, you should notice, for a moment, unanimous meant 12-0. New York, they knew that they were going to be one of the first places hit if there was a war. And so they actually fought against independence for most of this year because they were going to be the ones paying the price for it. And when the war does start, the British do immediately park the biggest fleet ever seen right off of New York and so on. But they also said, we don't have the authority to vote yes or no. New York didn't say we could do this. And so they kind of dragged their feet a little, but they did agree by a few days later. And so happy birthday, America. This is the birthday part. Now, if you're going to declare independence from England, that means you no longer can use their government. You must fully come up with your own. And America's first rule book was called the Articles of Confederation. When I teach this to an 11th or 12th grader, I spend a little time on the word confederation. What does that mean? And a synonym for a confederation is an alliance. So if we're in alliance in World War II, America, England, and Russia, can you make anyone do something? No. You can say, hey, would you agree to help me? And then the people in your alliance can say yes or no. That's the first government the 13 states formed. They formed a 13-state alliance. And here's the key thing about the Articles of Confederation. You couldn't make anyone do anything. We could take a vote. And unless the vote was 13-0, you really couldn't make anyone do something. And so this was by design. The first government Americans formed was one that allowed each of the states to be its own country. So if you were living in Rhode Island, in a way, you were living in the country of Rhode Island. If you're living in Delaware, you're kind of like the country of Delaware. And you're part of an alliance where you all agreed that if we don't beat England, we're going to die. And so that's what the first government was. They wrote the document, and how long did it take for all 13 of them to agree to it? 4 years. So I'm going to ask this question every so often. Is this a pretty united group? Not really. There's one thing that unites them, this fight against England. They lose. Now, to wrap up this war, the last decisive battle was at Yorktown. That's where Washington and Lafayette had trapped Cornwallis. Cornwallis surrendered an army of 7,000 people, which in that time was a pretty big, like, you're not going to carry on after that. But it takes time to go from the decisive battle to working out the legal agreement that ends the war. So the Treaty of Paris in 1783, England's making it official. King George III is making it official. You're your own country. Good luck. Grr. Now, 1783 is an important year for a couple of reasons. One, the war with England is over, but now the thing that creates unity in America is gone. The one thing that holds these 13, countries together fighting against England, well, the fight's over. Some of the great Americans of this time period, by 1783, that part of that time period, were starting to fear that everything America had fought for in the Revolution was going to be lost through disunity. We're not pulling together. We don't seem to agree on things. Individual states are kind of fighting against each other on things. Well, you can see it. And it took place in 1786. Only 5 states showed up. 8 states didn't care enough to show up. Unity, disunity. Disunity. Hey, I can't make it. I'm fishing. I'll see you later. 5 states showed up. The only thing that happened of significance in 1786 at the Annapolis Constitutional Convention was a guy named Alexander Hamilton said, well, maybe we should try to do this again next year. Okay. They agreed. The one next year, 1787, that's where the Constitution is written. It's written in Philadelphia, and 12 states show up. So I'm just going to give you a little fact. Only 5 states show up to the first one. You can't accomplish anything with 5 out of 13. Let's try it again next year. 12 states show up the next time they do it. Something happened on the way to the forum. A big rebellion happened in Massachusetts. Shays' Rebellion is a rebellion where, in the end, Shays and other people are angry at how the government's treating them. Some of them feel that the government owes them money from fighting in the Revolutionary War and so on. And anyone here who's ever had issues with government knows that sometimes government does this. I'm not in charge, he's in charge. And then he says, no, and they keep ping-ponging you against each other. So the people in Massachusetts, they want to get paid in some instances. And when they go to Uncle Sam in Philadelphia, they're like, you're wrong. You are part of Massachusetts' militia. They're the ones that are supposed to pay you. You show up in Boston, I don't know what you're talking about. And so eventually there's enough frustration that a rebellion occurs. When the rebellion occurs, Massachusetts asks the national government for help. And that's laughable because their national government wasn't strong. They couldn't help. They couldn't really help put down Massachusetts' rebellion. In the end, Massachusetts figured it out. They put down the rebellion. But people in all 13 colonies, all 13 states, are starting to become concerned that maybe the national government can't cut it. A rebellion happens in Massachusetts, and they're not an option to help fix this. Oddly enough, there were other people who thought Shays' Rebellion was an example of the government overreacting. In other words, some people got killed. Some of the rebels were executed. And there's another group of Americans who's like, I can't believe the government would do that. We need to do. And so a bunch of people are going to want to show up to the Second Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the one that writes the rule book that we still use today. I put in here a quote. It says, an assembly of demigods. Anyone know who the hell would call 55 lawyers an assembly of demigods? Who said that? Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was not there because America made him the first ambassador to France. John Adams wasn't there because he became America's first ambassador to England. But there were a lot of people who were part of the 55 who showed up. The most important person, in a sense, is George Washington. He's immediately asked, will you preside as the president of this convention? He says, okay. George Washington is not an ideas guy. You know who is? Alexander Hamilton. And they're connected. Hamilton is there. He's an ideas guy. But I ask my 12th graders every year, who's the father of the Constitution? And more often than not, they get this answer wrong. First, is Jefferson the father of the Constitution? He wasn't there. Can't be him, right? So anyone know? Who was the father of the United States Constitution? I'm sorry? No. Who? Madison, James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. If you Google that, like you'll see it's James Madison. And if you're asked, well, why? What makes James Madison so special? He read everything he could find about constitutional things so that he'd be prepared for this convention. But more importantly, he wrote his own constitution. Like, what's the best? Like, that's the best thing you could do to come prepared. And it became known as the Virginia Plan. And in the Virginia Plan, what Madison thought was fair, however big your population is, that should dictate how many people you send to the Congress. And there's a logic behind that. And so I'm going to give you three numbers. If you belong to a state that has 10,000 people, you belong to a state that has 100,000 people, and you belong to a state with 1 million. Well, if if each citizen pays $1 in taxes, your state raised 10,000, your state raised 100,000, your state raised 1 million. Virginia was the most populous state. And they had a simple premise. Rhode Island, you and I were not equals. Connecticut, you and I are not equals. Delaware, you and I are not equals. I pay 100 times more in taxes. I should have 100 times the number of votes in the Congress. So that was Madison's plan. 2 houses of Congress, they're both based on population. Now, I already told you a hint. I think the weirdest of the 13 states is Rhode Island. I think they're weirdos. They're the only state that didn't show up. Like, what are you doing in Rhode Island? That's so important. Like, whoa, we're lobster fishing, guys. Back off. Like, what's your deal, Rhode Island? But they didn't send anyone. And I'll talk about that more later. But they were represented by what was known as the New Jersey Plan, the small state plan. The existing rule in the articles was every state had an equal vote. So if you're Virginia, you get 1 vote. If you're Connecticut, you get 1 vote. That was the current set of rules. And Madison wanted to change that and make sure it's based in population. There'd be no constitution if we went just with Madison. And there'd be no constitution if we went just with New Jersey. And so the great compromise is what they worked out and is still true today. The House of Representatives is based on population. And you know how many representatives California sends to the Congress? 54 total. 52 in the House and 2 in the Senate. But if the House of Representatives has 435 members, 52 of them are from the state of California. Why? We're the most populous state in the Union. How many senators do we get to send? 2. Rhode Island, 2. South Dakota, 2. Everyone else is equal in the Senate. So the small states won the Senate, the big states won the House. But they worked that out here. And again, that's why Jefferson called them demigods. And I gave this away. What's the number 1 occupation of these 55 people? They're lawyers. They know how to write a constitution, and they did a great job. Now, I gave you one of those compromises. The Constitution's historically called a bundle of compromises because there's no real agreement on how long a president should serve, how long a senator. They had to work all of that out. If you read the original document from 1787, they did. They said, well, if you're in the House, you have to be at least 25. Senate, you have to be at least 30. President, you have to be at least 35. President will be 4 years at a time. House will be 2. Senate will be 6. They worked all of that out there. And each one of those was an argument. Now, I put in something I think is interesting. If I asked you to look up the document they wrote in 1787, it had 7 sections. Hence, it had 7 articles. I think Article 7 is genius. And so here's the premise. Prior to this convention, under the Articles of Confederation, in order to change the national rules, all 13 states had to agree. And I already told you what about Rhode Island. They're not even there. So they're not even there. You're going to have to go back and convince them. It took a unanimous vote to change the national rule book. In Article 7, a couple things happened in Philadelphia. First, the very first thing the 55 demigods did, they ordered, lock the door, shut the windows. They were only told to propose changes. And the first order of business is they said, why don't we just admit amongst ourselves, we need to start over. The articles are like, let's write a new document. Do we have authority to do that? Who cares? We need to do that. And they agreed to that. In the beginning, the first thing they do is agree to exceed their authority. They had a genius way of fixing their problem. Article 7, the last thing that they wrote, said that if 9 states approve this document, it will go into effect in those 9 states. That was genius. They got around this problem that in order to make a constitution, a new rulebook work, it had to be unanimous. Unanimous is stupid. That's a terrible standard to decide things. There's only one thing in America we still consistently say needs a unanimous vote: jury trials. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a dangerous standard to say 12 adults must agree in order to settle this case. Now, if I ask you a civics question, to find someone guilty of murder, what does the vote have to be? 12-0, right? 11-1, it's a hung jury. 6-6, it's a hung jury. I'm going to ask you another question. To find someone not guilty of murder, what must the vote be? 12-0. If you don't get 12-0, the case doesn't end, you don't conclude. If you have a hung jury of 11-1, 6-6, 8-4, it's a mistrial. The judge bangs his gavel, declares that it's a mistrial, and then the government either takes another shot at prosecuting you for murder or they give up. The national rulebook required a unanimous vote with all 13 states, and I'm just going to tell you something, that's stupid. The founding fathers were not stupid. They wrote their own rule. The last rule in the Constitution was, if 9 states approve it, it goes into effect. In my textbook, there is a little heading that says the 4 laggard states. And here's what that means. 9 states said yes pretty fast. 4 states were not sure. The 4 states that weren't sure that they wanted this new rulebook, the most important state, Virginia, one of the most important, New York, a big daddy, North Carolina, an old craphead, Rhode Island. 4 states weren't sure. And they all had different reasons for saying they have a lot to lose. And one of those states, New York, is why there are Federalist Papers. That's why Hamilton, Burr, and Madison wrote letters to the editor in not the Eagle, but whatever newspapers they wrote in, saying the Constitution's good, you should vote for it. This is interesting because 9 states said yes, and it meant with those other 4, if you don't approve the Constitution, you're going to keep the old rule book and you're going to be your own country. And in the end, all of them do say yes, including Rhode Island. Now, the Constitution was written in 1787. It went into effect in 1789, but it took a little bit of time because, again, state by state, you have to vote yes, whether or not you're approving the Constitution. And then by March and April of 1789, we have a United States Congress. And then George Washington, they elected him in the Electoral College, and they kind of speeded things along. He's sworn in on April 30th, 1789. Rhode Island was so late to approving it that they actually approved the Constitution after Washington's even in office. They need that much time to figure out. So I write this question, what's the deal with Rhode Island? And so I'm going to ask you yet another retort. Yes. I'm sorry? That is true. They were certainly concerned the government would be too strong and that it would strip away their rights. But I'm going to ask you a question first. How many people lived in Rhode Island at that time? I tell my kids 8 because I think that's a funny answer. 70,000 roughly. There were roughly 70,000 people living in Rhode Island at the time, and they were a small state. They had everything to lose. Under the old government, you couldn't tell them what to do, couldn't make them do anything. And they're actually being rational. They're like, if I sign in, I can't sign out. And if I make that decision, I'll never have that same amount of leverage or authority. And so that's why they took the longest. They felt like we better think this out because if we join, that's it. And so they do finally join, but that's their reason for being kind of a rascal and taking a while to figure it all out. So I end you with this. What I think is sort of interesting is the lack of unity is what caused George Washington to attend the convention. The lack of unity is why there were founding fathers who showed up in Philadelphia to write this document, and from their point of view, to not throw away their victory in the Revolutionary War. And there are these weird countervailing moments where the biggest crisis brings out the strongest leaders. I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville who said that he thought it was interesting that in the United States, it took a crisis for people like Washington to step forward and say, you know, I don't want to do this, but fine, I'll come and help out. And so I guess I'll end with Washington. A couple of things that I think are interesting about him. He didn't really want any of these leadership positions. He didn't want to be president. Everyone else, it was obvious you need to be the person to lead. And one of the things that history books will tell you about Washington, the only American respected in all 13 states, the only American trusted in all 13 states is Washington. When the war is over, he turned in his command. He didn't want it anymore. I want to go back to Mount Vernon. when they start picking a president. The only president elected unanimously in the history of the country by the Electoral College, Washington twice. Now, James Monroe fans will tell you they missed by 1 vote, and the guy who didn't vote to make it unanimous wanted to save that for Washington. But nonetheless, Washington's the only person elected unanimously. Adams, pretty cool guy, not liked in the South. Jefferson, pretty cool guy, not liked in the North. There was only one Washington. There was only one person who could kind of command that respect and that trust. He was elected unanimously twice. A lot of people wanted him to run a 3rd time, and he made it clear, won't do it. Try to do it. I'm going to go home to Mount Vernon no matter what you do. And so they do end up, who's the 2nd president? John Adams. Was it close? It was. He only beat Jefferson by 3 electoral votes. So in the history of this country, my own observation is we tend to be disunited more often than united. And we tend to be okay with that for some reason. And I don't get that. So when Washington leaves office, he gives a farewell address. He warns about 2 things. Don't join political parties. They're not productive. They don't put America first. We immediately formed political parties around Hamilton and Jefferson. And he warns against alliances, because the one we made with France created a lot of problems for us. And he's like, avoid those. And we can't avoid them. And that ends up creating problems for us as well. So I think it's interesting that people don't remember that, because the source of disunity right now, I would tell you, are our political parties. They're really focused on, loyalty to this cause. We all need to stick together. Whatever the other side's for, it's stupid by definition, because it's the other side. I heard a story once about Tom DeLay, and he heard that Brian, the guy that used to be the mayor of San Diego, who's in the Congress, Bob Filner noticed that it was illegal to send mail out with your social security number on it. You can't do it. It's illegal. There was only one agency doing that, the Social Security Administration. They were still mailing things out with your social security number showing. Apparently, Bob Filner caught that mistake. And Filner said, why don't we fix this? And Bill Bray, a Republican member of Congress, went to Tom DeLay, his leader, and said, Filner's right. We need to fix this. And Tom DeLay's answer, he's a Democrat. The Democrats are never right. He didn't want to fix it, because again, that's where we're at. We don't agree on things. If the other side's for it, I'm against it. And when I say unity then, unity now, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know if today's state of disunity will result in something positive, if people will snap out of it and find something to unify over, or it is just possible that maybe the American normal tendency of things is to be disunited. So to be continued on that point. That completes my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm going to let Christian take over for a second.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. It's an excellent time. Excellent time. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have the question and answer.
A little out of breath.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, Selena in the back should have a mic. And you can pass that one. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, yeah.
How you doing?
If it ever shows red, that's muted. There's a button on the bottom. I might need a pink one.
And then they're done.
And then this one is for the.
I don't worry.
But actually, let me go double check.
What I'm mainly about is the bottom button and that red.
Correct.
Yeah, that was a hell. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And then Jerison go further. If there's something that really wants to and maybe that's the reason that's the confidence that you need to do something. It's changing. It makes the fingers go down. Again, it's good. We get red and green. It's raining. Yeah, what's wrong? Put it out there. That would be.
Excellent. So now it's on mute. I hand it to him, and right before I hand him, I do that.
Young man.
If I can get everybody back to your seats, we'll start the question and answer portion of the program. And when you're ready to ask a question, get Morgan's attention. Morgan has the other Hawaiian shirt.
We have a question in the back.
So Morgan, will pass the mic to you and you can use the mic to ask your question.
Thank you, Christian. And ask away. This is usually the best part of any presentation is the question and answer for me.
Hi, I'm Sam Carr. Is it on?
Sam Carr?
Yes. Yeah, my question is, could you teach adult education? Because I would go to every class you taught.
Thank you. Well, we'll see. The superintendent was just here, so we can ask him what he thinks about that later. Thank you. I think we have a question up front.
Yeah, Casey, have you seen the movie Young Washington yet? And the question is basically, was he the only guy with a commission, even though it really wasn't from the king? Was he, after the French and Indian War, which really wasn't a win, but
As I understand it, he was a colonel in the Virginia militia.
exactly.
And so the admiral asked an interesting question: was Washington the only guy commissioned at a high level as an officer? So let me remind you that during we'll get to you, and you can give a better fact on this. The British were our army. The colonists didn't do a lot of fighting. They had a militia, a volunteer military for the things that they needed it for. But in breaking away from England, not only will the British not be doing the fighting for us with their professional redcoats, we're going to have to fight them. And we also don't have a West Point Academy yet. So we had a very limited number of colonials who had sufficient military experience, background, professionalism. But Washington was one who had risen to the rank of colonel in the Virginia militia. So that was part of what made him a front runner. If you're going to pick someone to command a Continental Army, there weren't too many people to choose from. Also, in the show John Adams, they like to make a joke. Franklin allegedly says, well, Washington's the tallest person in the room. He's bound to lead something. But the generic answer is, again, we didn't have too many militia leaders with a lot of military training. Dave, did you want to add to that?
A different question, but
Yes,
first of all, thank you for everything you've done for our community, whether it's in the school or whether it's the city council. We appreciate your dedication to the city of Coronado.
Thank you.
You mentioned briefly de Tocqueville, and I think it's easy to say that he is probably one of the most important observers of early American democracy. Is there anything else you can add about his observations when he came to the States about the state of our democracy? And also, is there perhaps a more current historian that has very potent observations of what happened back in the late 1700s as well?
So I'm going to give you a caveat. I read de Tocqueville's Democracy in America 30 years ago. So I only remember a couple of things, but the one observation of his that has always stuck with me is he thought it was interesting, again, that in America, our best leaders would come out in a crisis because they loved America, but that they usually would avoid politics. And so two people that always immediately hit that nerve for me, one would be Washington. This is a guy who didn't want to be the president, but he wanted what was best for America. He did it out of a sense of duty. The other guy that I think de Tocqueville's quote reminds me of is Eisenhower. Eisenhower is not a guy that really, I don't think, wanted a political career. And what's weird about Eisenhower, you may have heard this story, when Truman ran for re-election, in the famous year where he holds up the paper that says Dewey defeats Truman, every newspaper predicted he'd lose. And for good reason. There were 3 Democrats running at the same time, and Dewey was the only Republican. So before that election started, he asked General Eisenhower, would you like to run for president as a Democrat? I'll step out of the way. And Eisenhower's response reputedly was, no. I'm a soldier. I'm not a politician, and at the time, Truman and Eisenhower were friends. 4 years later, Eisenhower announces, I'm running for president as a Republican. That obviously takes Truman aback. And if you're going to run for president, I guarantee you they're going to ask why. Why are you running? And his answer was something to the effect, someone needs to clean up the mess that Truman made. And again, obviously, you can see that tear coming down Truman's face. And they end up hating each other. But taking all that aside, again, I think that's an interesting reminder that de Tocqueville was right, that in these key moments, people like Eisenhower, they do step forward. Another good example would be George Marshall. I like George Marshall far more than I like Eisenhower, because again, Marshall is who was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army throughout World War II. And one of the interesting stories is that Marshall was the one who picked Eisenhower. Marshall was the one that's like, this is your guy. And so Eisenhower became the first Supreme Allied commander by 1942 in North Africa, and on and on. For D-Day, the people who really like George Marshall wonder, did FDR ever consider switching them, taking Eisenhower, bringing him back to DC, and giving Marshall his chance to command troops? And the people who love George Marshall would tell you, a good general never asks for the job. So people who know Marshall think, yeah, he would have liked the chance to lead the cross-channel invasion, but it'll be a cold day in hell before he asks you for it. And so in the end, FDR is said to have made the conclusion that Marshall's irreplaceable in DC. I can't pick him up and move him there, whereas Eisenhower leading that will work. And so in the end, Eisenhower led the D-Day invasion. Marshall stayed put in DC. So decide what you think about that. I always feel a little bad that Marshall didn't get a chance to lead that big moment. So why am I talking about George Marshall? Because when World War II is over, Truman admired the heck out of George Marshall and said, I need you to stick around. I need to send you to China. They're in a civil war. I need you to be my Secretary of State. The Marshall Plan is named after him. Later, he even becomes Secretary of Defense. Like, the poor guy, they wouldn't let him retire. Like that, and that's, again, to me, kind of the exemplification of where de Tocqueville is right. The great Americans, they don't say no to duty. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Participated as a Shea Battalion?
I couldn't tell you. All I could tell you is Shays is Captain Daniel Shays. So he was, in the Revolutionary War. And again, I think there were issues about farmers and debt, but I couldn't tell you the exact numbers of how many people rebelled.
Thank you, young man.
Hello, Frank.
70,000 in Rhode Island. The total of the 13.
It was about 2.5 million was the total population at that time. Any other questions? We got a question over here. Looks like we have two questions coming.
Yeah, Casey, I'm just interested in some of your observations or your reflections on education for high school history studies, where you see that, strengths, weaknesses.
Now, is that like how are Coronado students doing? Or
no, in general.
Okay, well, I will tell you one interesting thing. If you wanted to become a history teacher, when I started, 27, 28 years ago, I was told to not lecture. And this makes sense, because when I was talking to you today, I saw one person fall asleep. I was having a hard, it's always hard to tell if people like what you have to say or not. You try to read their body language, if they're smiling and so on. And so as a rule of thumb, you're told don't lecture. Give kids things to do, split them up in groups, blah, blah, blah. But most of the teachers at Coronado High School do lecture anyway. And the reason they tell history teachers don't lecture is because there's no way to teach you how to be good at it. So if you can tell a story well, great. But if you can't tell a story well and you keep lecturing anyway, that's usually the history teacher people hate. And so that historically, I run into a lot of people who say that they hated their history teacher in 1960 or 70. And obviously some of you loved yours. But I would tell you, if you didn't like your history teacher, it's because they said, take out your books. Did you write that down? So Washington was sworn in 1789, and he served 8 years. So it's easier as an educational firmament to say don't lecture. But I think you need a few good storytellers. And so some people go rogue and do it anyway, like me. It doesn't always work out. Again, the ones who go rogue and aren't good at storytelling, bore a whole classroom. But I think the key to good teaching, I'll just wrap up my answer to you, is variation. If you do the same thing every day, it's going to bore people at some point. So if something works on Monday, you still need to come up with something different to do on Tuesday and something different to do on Wednesday. And you need to switch it up a little bit so that kids don't get kind of overly I know what you're going to do and I'm bored with it already.
I appreciate the variety of the 13 states. Do you have any comment to make about the prison system? Tocqueville came to examine the prison system, as did Charles Dickens. And why was our prison system so important to them?
So I'm going to tell you a secret. I don't like reading that much anymore. I used to like reading, and now I'd rather watch a TV show or a documentary. My AP US history teacher 32 years ago gave me a book, Crime and Punishment in America. That would have probably answered your question well, but I didn't read it because it looked boring. So I can't tell you that I know a ton about the American prison system in the 1700s. So I'm sorry, I don't have more for you on that.
Casey, you teach a history class, but you talk about unity and disunity. Does it ever spill over into current issues in politics? And if so, what do your students and also view as what will bring unity back to this country?
So I teach US history and I also teach US government, so civics. And a lot of people, when they know I teach government, they smile at me because Donald Trump gives you a lot of things you can teach about. And one of the things I mentioned is that I try to be very clinical about it. If I bring up something about President Trump, I usually try to think of something that Biden did. So you have point counterpoint. And if Biden's president, you're Trump, or Trump, Obama. I try to show what both parties do. That way it doesn't seem like I'm just zeroing in on the Republicans or the Democrats. So generally speaking, I enjoy teaching government for that reason. I enjoy being clinical about things. I don't think high schoolers are that interested in any of this. I try to bring out that interest, and I think sometimes it comes up. But my own theory is that we as adults have modeled bad behavior politically, and that they're turned off by it. So when I run into adults who say it's a shame we don't teach civics, I have to tell them, but we do. They can't graduate without it, and that maybe the reason your kid seems apathetic about politics or that not knowledgeable is because they're not interested in it. Like, we haven't done anything as adults to make politics interesting to them. They say, so the voting rate used to be 75, 80%. In the old days, families would have dinner together and talk about things. Well, do we still do that? That's probably a bigger reason why kids aren't that interested in politics. And it's easy. It's never been easier to get information in the hands of the kid. But again, I think that their apathy is really just a reflection of we model some pretty ugly political behavior.
Another question, raise your hand. Oh, and I have one while you guys are waiting to raise your hand. Wait, I have to turn it on though. What was your favorite memory from being the mayor of Coronado?
I don't know if you remember, there was a college basketball game that was played on the Carl Vinson. So the University of North Carolina played Michigan State. That was probably, there are good times to be the mayor of Coronado, and that was one. First, North Carolina, that's a very famous basketball program. They played in the city gym, and someone told me about it, and I'm like, I'm going down there. And so when I showed up to the gym, our top IT person was guarding the door, no unauthorized personnel. And he's like, Mayor, come on in, because there's our employee, so I could get right in. And so I was just standing up there watching UNC play, and Roy Williams was the coach at the time. And some assistant coach that I have no idea who he is, just very kind of calmly said, hi, who are you? And I was like, I'm the mayor. Just let me keep watching. Michigan State practiced in the high school gym, and I didn't know about that. But some of the people who like Michigan State, they were able to see that. And then, I was able to watch that game. A good friend of mine went to UNC, so that was the person I invited to kind of enjoy that game. I think we saw Eric Montross, all 7'1" of him walking somewhere. So just like the NASCAR event was probably a pretty memorable event for Mayor Duncan and the people who were able to participate in it. I would say that was the most memorable event when I was mayor. All right, any other questions? All right, well, it looks like that's wrapping it up. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed having a chance to speak.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation, Casey. Thank you for coming. And thank you all for coming to our program today. And we look forward to having you here next month. Yeah,